So when we talked about it last time, we identified a couple of main functions, a couple of main features of hemoglobin dissociation curve. First, we figured that in the environment with a high oxygen concentration, basically the lungs, the hemoglobin saturation does not change dramatically if oxygen pressure decreases. And that provides a way, physiological way to adapt for a life at certain elevation. Okay, when you go at certain elevation, hemoglobin saturation stays high, despite the fact that partial pressure of oxygen in the air is lower than at the sea level. And then we identified another interesting feature of that curve. It becomes really steep at the lower oxygen pressures, suggesting that when your tissues are oxygen deprived, when partial pressure of oxygen is low, the unloading dramatically increases, and that in turn increases the availability of oxygen for the tissues. So far, good. Now, let's talk about the physiological factors that lead to increased or decreased unloading of oxygen. And I have a whole intention to spend a little bit of time on that. Okay? So, sort of a summary up front. Elevated temperature, elevated concentration of hydrogen ions or low pH, elevated carbon dioxide, and elevated levels of biphosphoglycerate, BPG. It all increases oxygen unloading. Now, what I want to go over is, what happens, how they do it, and why these factors increase oxygen unloading. What is the physiological reason behind it? So, general mechanism. All of these factors, whether it's elevated CO2 or elevated acidity, they all change the hemoglobin structure. As structure of hemoglobin changes, its ability to find oxygen decreases, meaning oxygen is more readily unloading from the hemoglobin molecule and is going into the tissues. So oxygen is not as tightly bound to hemoglobin anymore. Now, it's important to understand that these factors all are present in the systemic capillaries. And that's where unloading of oxygen actually happens. Does that make sense to you? So let me go over this again, because that's really important. If you go into the systemic capillaries, into the tissues basically, and measure pH, pH is lower, CO2 is higher, temperature is higher compared to the lungs, and concentration of BPG, biphosphoglycerate, is higher as well. Does that make sense to you? That whole statement? Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah. So all these factors, CO2, temperature, hydrogen ion concentration, meaning acidity, and BPG concentration, all these factors are elevated in the tissues. Okay? Does that make sense? And therefore, if these factors go down, if CO2 concentration goes down, acidity goes down, temperature decreases, all of that will decrease oxygen unloading. Does that make sense? Now, let's talk about the curve shift. And for that, actually, I'm going to do something different. So I'm going to do this. Okay, so that just, let's see what happens to the curve. And I'm going to explain why curve shifts in a certain direction. I'm going to draw a hemoglobin dissociation curve for you. So that's partial pressure of oxygen. This is hemoglobin saturation. Are you with me? Good? So this is your hemoglobin saturation curve. Okay, very approximate. Now this is the saturation at 100, and this is the saturation at 40. You with me? Let's take a look how much oxygen is actually unloaded. That's the unloading. I'm not going to give any numbers. Numbers are not that important. Does that make sense? Now, let's see what happens if this curve shifts to the right. I'm going to draw the curve that shifts to the right in the red color. So that's the right shift. Okay? It's pretty considerable right shift, to be honest. Now, look what happens to the unloading. At the same partial pressure of oxygen, what's the unloading? Is that bigger or smaller than it was at the sort of normal temperature? Much bigger. Does that make sense?
So this is only when one of those factors decreases?
Goes up. Now, the purpose of what I'm doing here is to show you that when we say oxygen unloading increases, that corresponds to the right shift of the curve. I'm just showing you why right shift. Now, oxygen unloading decreases. Well, guess what? The curve is going to be shifted to the left. You see that? Now, it's kind of a convenient way to quickly estimate what happens in terms of the unloading of oxygen at different conditions. Does that make sense to you? The explanation why right shift corresponds to the higher unloading. Let's go back to that. So first, let's talk about why this changes in these four parameters happen in the tissues. So what happens in the tissues? Cellular respiration. When tissues respire, they use glucose and oxygen. The product of that respiration, carbon dioxide. So CO2 in the tissues goes up. If there is increase in CO2, there's going to be an increase in hydrogen ion concentration. Does that make sense? So any metabolically active tissue has higher concentration of CO2 and hydrogen ions. Does that make sense to you? We're clear. Now, elevated hydrogen ions lead to the decreased blood pH. And this decreased blood pH and elevated CO2 will shift the curve to the right. Look at the image in the bottom right corner of the slide. So this graph in the center shows you the hemoglobin dissociation curve, the normal conditions. Okay. Now, when arterial CO2 increases as the result of, let's say, very intensive cellular respiration, the curve shifts to the right. Does that make sense? Let me show you what is the outcome of this. So that's 40, okay? Now, this red arrow shows you the oxygen unloading at the normal concentration of CO2. Can you see that? At 40 millimeters of oxygen. Can you see that? If you can, blink once. If you can't, blink twice, please. Now, this blue arrow shows you the unloading at the higher CO2 concentration. So unloading of oxygen at the higher CO2 concentration, is it higher or lower? Higher. The arrow is bigger. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, here's the basic physiological link. When your tissues are metabolically active, they produce carbon dioxide. Do you agree with me? When they're metabolically active, do they need more oxygen or less oxygen? More. So that carbon dioxide basically pushes the oxygen out of hemoglobin, so there will be more unloading in those metabolically active tissues. Does that make sense? The higher the metabolic activity of the tissues, the more oxygen is going to unload in those tissues. Am I clear? So this response, particularly increased unloading in the conditions with elevated CO2 and hydrogen ions, is called Bohr effect. Okay? So the more tissues that respire more intensely receive more oxygen. And here's the deal. Same happens in the tissues. Tissues that are metabolically active. What happens to the temperature in those tissues? It goes up. And it turns out elevated temperature will also cause the curve shift to the right. Look at the image on the right side at the top. Okay? So elevated temperature will cause the shift of the unloading curve to the right. Does it make sense? Now, here's the deal. And decreased temperature will cause the shift to the left. Can you see that? So, elevated temperature shift to the right, decreased temperature shift to the left. Now, before we move on anywhere, let's kind of look. There are a lot of words, but I want to summarize this in the very physiological observations. Let's talk about metabolically active tissues, and as the best example, we will pick muscles. Active muscles. Do they do cellular respiration? Yes. Do they produce CO2? Yes. Do they utilize oxygen? Yes. So as they produce CO2, what happens? The next few questions will be absolutely dumb. When muscles produce CO2, what happens to the CO2 concentration in the muscles? It increases. Now, this question is not that dumb. When CO2 concentration increases, how does it change pH? Decreases it. CO2 is acidic gas, okay? So pH is low, meaning hydrogen ions are high, right? When muscles respire, they also produce BPG. As they produce BPG concentration in the muscles increases. So we've got high CO2, high acidity, high BPG, and on top of that, a metabolically active high temperature. Does that make sense? All these factors will increase unloading of oxygen from hemoglobin. Are we clear? Because this oxygen is needed by muscle cells for cellular respiration. Now let's take a turn and go back into the lungs. Compared to the rest of the tissues, concentration of carbon dioxide in the lungs is lower or higher? Lower. We exhale it, right? Temperature. That's a bit tricky, but not really. Temperature in the lungs. Unless you're in Libya. Lower. Your body temperature is, well, on Louisiana, okay. Your body temperature is 37. Ambient temperature is usually what? 25, 30 degrees Celsius, right? It's definitely lower than your body temperature. What about, so since carbon dioxide is low, acidity is low. So in the lungs, you have all these factors that I have on top. All these factors are decreased. We can put decrease in these factors. That's lungs. Does that make sense? Now, when these factors are decreased, it's not unloading that happens. Loading happens. You see what I'm saying? Does it make sense? Please give me some kind of a sign that it does or it doesn't. It's totally fine. If it doesn't, we'll explain it again. Make sense? So
it has to load in the lungs so it can get the oxygen to the system.
Exactly. And consider it maybe as, it's not really a signal, it's a physiological mechanism. But if you think about it, it makes perfect sense that in the conditions of metabolically active tissues, unloading increases. And in the condition of lungs, unloading decreases, so the loading can occur. That's perfectly logical physiological response. Does that make sense? Now, carbon dioxide that is present in the blood is a really important buffer system. In fact, it's called bicarbonate buffer system, is the most important buffering system in the blood. Okay? So, what happens with carbon dioxide? By the way, is there water in the blood? Yeah. There's water, right, in plasma. So when carbon dioxide interacts with water, what is produced? Acid, carbonic acid. And when carbonic acid dissociates, it dissociates into proton and bicarbonate. Does that make sense? So, here's the deal. How does this system work? If you have elevated amount of protons, basically higher acidity of the blood, more protons, they will bind bicarbonate, forming carbonic acid. Carbonic acid will dissociate into carbon dioxide and water. You're going to exhale carbon dioxide. If you have low concentration of hydrogen ions, basically alkalosis, which is super rare, you're going to have more dissociations of carbonic acid. You're not going to inhale more. You're just going to have probably some minor respiratory response to it. Does that make sense? So this bicarbonate and carbonic acid that you have in the blood, they actually stabilize your blood pH very effectively. Does that make sense? Now, how do changes in your respiratory rate affect the pH of the blood? And it's really interesting. So, if you breathe slowly and not very deep, for instance, you have some kind of a lung condition, respiratory condition, okay, so you can't make a proper inhalation, then you do not exhale enough CO2. Are you following me? So CO2 starts to accumulate in the blood, and that will decrease your blood pH, increase its acidity. Does that make sense? Now, if it goes for a really long time, not minutes, but days, and the respiratory problem is not fixed, and say your kidneys don't really do a fine job, what's going to happen to you? How does acid influence the activity of neurons in the brain? Yeah, inhibits them. So technically, if you do slow, shallow breathing, you can put yourself in coma. Well, you have to get rid of functional kidneys first, because kidneys kind of will try to stabilize it. But acidification of the blood can put you in a coma. Now, what's more interesting, in my opinion, is, well, I cannot really imagine myself breathing rapid, slow and shallow. It's really hard for me. Does that make sense? Because my respiratory center will immediately trigger normal breathing. Okay? But we can do this. Rapid and deep breathing. What we refer to as hyperventilation. Now, you have to distinguish normal ventilation and exercise. Think about your breathing rate and depth when you working out. It's elevated, right? When we talk about hyperventilation, we refer to the breathing that is not dictated by your physiological needs. Does that make sense? So if I'm sitting right here, I will start hyperventilating. Okay? What's going to be the outcome? Okay, hold on. Yes, you pass out. You blow off all the CO2 and rise in pH, right? So two outcomes. First, a low CO2 and elevated pH lead to constriction of the brain blood vessels. That makes sense? And vasoconstriction in the cerebral vasculature, you're going to faint. Make sense? That's for for a healthy person. When I was a kid, when I was in middle school, that was one of the best things that we could do after school. You go outside with your friends, you stand next to the tree, you hyperventilate to make sure everything works. Your friend pushes on your chest really hard to completely stop blood flow to the brain, and you pass out. It was fun until I hit my head against the concrete wall and got stitches without anesthesia. That was pretty bad. But, that was the game. Another interesting outcome of hyperventilation. So, since neurons get severely inhibited in acidosis, what happens to neuronal activity in alkalosis? Increases, right? If it decreases in acidosis, it increases in alkalosis. It was shown that in people who suffer from epilepsy, hyperventilation may lead to epileptic bout because of elevated neuronal activities. Make sense? And have you heard about breathing in the bag? Does it have any physiological meaning? It does. Because when people are really nervous and emotional and start to hyperventilate, they can pass out because they will blow out all CO2. Does that make sense? When you put a bag in front of them, they exhale that CO2 into the bag and inhale it back, basically maintaining normal blood pH while they are hyperventilating. Because you can't really tell them stop breathing like that, right? I mean, until they kind of calm down. You see what I'm saying? So it's a good physiological treatment for potential consequences of hyperventilation. Now, a couple more pathogenic stuff. So, hypoxia is a general name to lower than normal delivery of oxygen to the tissues. Where can it stem from? Anemic, too few red blood cells. Various sources, we discussed that it can be I don't know, aplastic because of bone marrow failure or iron deficiency or pernicious deficit of vitamin B12. Now, ischemic, circulatory problems. Usually ischemic hypoxia is not systemic, okay, unless there is some intrinsic cardiac defect. Histotoxic, one of my favorite cases. There's a toxin, potassium cyanide. You've heard about it. It's a pretty powerful inhibitor of the cellular respiration. Does that make sense? So if you take potassium cyanide, oxygen in the mitochondria is not used for cellular respiration. Now, what do you think are going to be so what essentially happens? Cells, all cells, cannot respire intracellularly. Okay? Now, say you have a person, well, a deceased person who died of potassium cyanide poisoning. Apart from damaged mitochondria, a few questions. Question number one, probably the main question. What would be the oxygen concentration in the blood of that recently deceased person? High or low? That's a hard question. Cells cannot respire. How? It will be very high because oxygen is not used. But for the brain, potassium cyanide poisoning is basically a suffocation. So the compensatory response to inability to respire is to try and breathe in more. Does that make sense? So people will have like enormously saturated plasma, enormous oxygen concentration in all tissues, but it cannot be used. There was actually a case, which is still a cold case, when in Chicago, I want to say in the 60s, there was a chain of cyanide poisonings associated with the Tylenol syrup. It was sold in the pharmacies, and people were taking Tylenol like the normal drug, and it was laced with cyanide, and quite a few people died. And still, it is unknown who did that. It was never discovered. But those people were found just in those conditions. Now, hypoxemic problems with ventilation, usually obstructive pulmonary disease. Now, I would put carbon monoxide poisoning separately. It's just fascinating, the mechanism. So, carbon monoxide, CO, binds to hemoglobin, not just to hemoglobin, binds to iron in hemoglobin. Does that make sense? Same exact location. Binds to iron and effectively prevents oxygen from binding. And carbon monoxide binds 200 times better, stronger than oxygen. Are we clear? So, when people inhale, and carbon monoxide has no smell and no color, people don't know that they're exposed to it. When they inhale it, essentially hemoglobin cannot carry oxygen anymore because it's occupied by CO. The first treatment, take them outside so they can breathe normal air. Because chemically, if you have overwhelming amount of oxygen, it will start to slowly substitute carbon monoxide. I'm looking at, have you ever saw carbon monoxide poisoning victims?
Not so severe where they were like that. Like I've seen them where they've been exposed to it. They're having a little bit of difficulty, but
Okay.
they're going to be okay.
Okay, because there's one very characteristic sign of carbon monoxide poisoning associated with the skin color. Go ahead.
Your skin turns like
Cherry red. Because the complex between hemoglobin and carbon monoxide gives blood bright cherry red color. And you can Google it basically. Hence, bright red. Very characteristic. Okay. Now, we kind of wrapped up oxygen transport. And I must say, so the part about transport itself is fairly easy. I'm going to ask you a lot of questions about, well, as many as 50 question format of the exam allows me to do. But you have to be ready for questions about hemoglobin dissociation curve. That's one. So know exactly what happens at the high oxygen partial pressure, low oxygen partial pressure. Am I clear? And second thing that you need to be ready for. How does elevated pH affect unloading? Got it? And you should be able not only answer, 50-50, like increases, decreases. You should be able to say, like, increases unloading in tissues or decreases unloading in tissues. You know what I'm talking about? So there will be a lot of these physiology regulatory questions. Now, we're getting to, for me as the former chemist, the most interesting part of the respiration, the transport of carbon dioxide in the blood. It's really cool. So it is transported by 3 routes. The small amount is dissolved in the plasma. 20% are bound to hemoglobin in the form of so-called carbaminohemoglobin. And 70%, the majority, is transported as bicarbonate ions. That statement, is that clear? Now let's get rid of some of the things here. So, dissolved in the plasma. Here it is. Not interesting. I just cross out any questions about dissolved in the plasma. It's the gas in the plasma. That's it. Second. Sorry. Carbaminohemoglobin. Now, here you have carbon dioxide that diffuses from tissues. It diffuses into the blood and into the red blood cell. Remember, hemoglobin is in the red blood cells. Are you with me so far? So it diffuses in the red blood cell and binds to hemoglobin. What I want to highlight, and it's really important, it binds to the protein component. Now, let me ask you this. Oxygen in the hemoglobin, what does it bind to? Iron. Carbon dioxide doesn't bind to the iron. It doesn't compete with oxygen. Are we clear? We cool? Understood? Awesome. Now, let's take a glance at the transport via bicarbonate. Okay? So first part is in the plasma. So carbon dioxide in the plasma reacts with water. Okay? The reaction with water is slow, and the product of that slow reaction is bicarbonate. Oh, sorry, carbonic acid. Yes, thank you. Carbonic acid dissociates into bicarbonate and hydrogen ion. So far, does that make sense? Now, from the standpoint of human physiology, hydrogen ions are not a good thing to have. So they have to be buffered. And this hydrogen ion binds to the proteins in plasma, mainly albumin. So albumin works as the buffer. for hydrogens. You with me so far? Next one is same reaction in the red blood cell. Now, look at this. Carbon dioxide and water in the red blood cell, they react very quickly because there is an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase that facilitates this reaction. Am I clear? We're good? So, carbonic acid dissociates into the bicarbonate and hydrogen ion. We're good? Then it's just all the same stuff. We learned it in endocrine system, we learned it in gastrointestinal system. So what happens next? This bicarbonate goes into the plasma in exchange for chloride. So this is called chloride shift. What's left in the red blood cell is hydrogen ion, and we need to buffer it. What is the most common protein in the red blood cell? In the red blood cell, which protein is the most common? In hemoglobin. That's like the only protein that's there. Does that make sense? So that protein binds protons. Does that make sense? Now, prepare for somewhat unexpected outcome of this. When the protein binds to hemoglobin, does it change its shape? What do you think? Can it? Sure. Yeah, why not? So it turns out binding of that hydrogen ion by hemoglobin changes the hemoglobin affinity to oxygen. And oxygen gets dissociated from hemoglobin. We called it a Bohr effect. Does that make sense? So let me put it in line for you. We've got carbon dioxide that reacts with water in the red blood cell. That reaction produces carbonic acid, which dissociates and produces hydrogen ion. And that hydrogen ion, when it reacts with hemoglobin, it basically pushes the oxygen out, increasing unloading of oxygen in the tissues. Does that make sense? It's kind of mechanistic explanation why we observed the Bohr effect. Does that make sense? Cool.
So where does the chloride go? Just hang out?
Hold on. It's the start, right? Where does this happen? I mean, in the lungs or in the tissues? This. Tissues. So it's not a final picture, right? Does that make sense? This is what happens in the lungs. So, blah, 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 CO2 dissolved in plasma goes in alveoli. Yeah, that's all right. Now, here's the deal. Jesus, I don't want to talk about chemical equilibrium. I will try not to. Okay? It's so much easier with chemical equilibrium, but I will try not to. So, in the lungs, hydrogen recombines with bicarbonate, forming carbonic acid. Carbonic acid dissociates into carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide diffuses in the alveoli and is exhaled. We clear? Does that idea make sense? The whole thing is basically reverted. Now, Aaron, to your question about chloride shift. It goes the other way around in the lungs. So bicarbonate gets into the red blood cell, chloride gets out. So, you know, it doesn't stay there just for the transport matter, right? Now, what happens in the lungs? In the lungs, oxygen binds to hemoglobin, right? So as hydrogen from hemoglobin dissociates. It binds to bicarbonate, producing carbonic acid, which dissociates to carbon dioxide and water. In the meantime, oxygen binds to hemoglobin right here, forming oxyhemoglobin that will get in the blood and deliver the stuff. Does that make sense? No? I wanted to avoid that terrible conversation about chemical equilibrium. Guess I will have to. No worries. Just embrace it. It's physical chemistry. I know. What can be more fun? All right. So this is the concept of chemical equilibrium. You can explain it very basic. So if you have a reaction in which A is converted to B, you with me so far? How can you speed up this reaction? You can either add more A. That makes sense? Like, you burn the coal. How can you make it more intense? You just add more coal. Or, second way, it's not so obvious. You can remove the B from the reaction. Meaning that if you take the product out, the system shifts towards making more product. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying? Think about it for a second. So if you have a chemical system and it produces some kind of a product, as long as you're removing the product from the system, the whole chemical story will be to make more because it's imbalanced. Does it make sense? Because it's not an equilibrium. You remove the product, it's not an equilibrium. All right? Now, let's take a look from that standpoint on what's going on in the lungs. So I'm going to start the whole story over. And the first reaction that I want to point your attention, not reaction, physical process, is the diffusion of carbon dioxide from plasma into the alveoli. Let me ask you this. What happens to carbon dioxide that's in the alveoli? What do we do with it? We constantly exhale it. So we maintain low concentration of CO2 in the alveoli. Does that make sense? Now, compared to the concentration of CO2 in the blood, we have a gradient. Does that make sense, that idea? Do you understand what I'm saying? So we have more CO2 in the blood than in the alveoli because we exhale CO2 from alveoli. Is that clear? Well, good. Any questions about that statement? No? Cool. Now, let's take a look at the plasma transport in the form of carbon dioxide. Now, look closely. I'm going to start from the end. That's CO2 right here. Its concentration is at high or low in the alveoli? Low. We constantly exhale. Well, I wouldn't say low, lower than in the blood. That makes sense? So that CO2 will be constantly moving from the blood into the alveolus. Does that make sense? Because there's gradient. Because there's gradient. So far, gradient idea. Does that make sense? Now, look at the reaction. This is here the product. Got it? You're constantly removing the product from the reaction. When you remove the product from the reaction, the whole equilibrium will shift, in this case, to the left. Do you understand what I just said? So you remove the product, which is CO2. It leaves blood where reaction happens and goes somewhere else, the alveolus, right? So you don't have CO2 here, which means that the equilibrium of this reaction will be constantly shifted to the left. That makes sense? Therefore, facilitating this binding and this dissociation, so on and so forth, because you remove CO2. If you stop for some reason, if you stop removing CO2, that doesn't happen. CO2 will stay in the blood. That doesn't happen. Does it make sense for you? Okay, we're good? Is that understood? Blink once, twice, whatever. Show me some kind of, or I don't understand. Can you go over it again? Is that good? Now, look what happens in the red blood cell. With carbaminohemoglobin, the story is practically the same as with dissolved CO2. Concentration of CO2, the pressure of CO2 in the alveolus is low. So this carbon dioxide here constantly diffuses into the alveolus. So we remove CO2 from the reaction, which shifts the equilibrium to the left. That makes sense? So carbaminohemoglobin will just dissociate as long as we exhale. We're clear. Now, last thing, which is, a little more steps, it's not complicated, is the transport, bicarbonate transport in red blood cells. This carbon dioxide, now you tell me, this carbon dioxide, where does it diffuse? Into the alveoli. Why? Because again, the low concentration in alveolus, lower concentration in alveolus compared to the red blood cell creates a gradient. It diffuses following the gradient. Does that make sense? Now, since this carbon dioxide, it essentially leaves the reaction, that removal of carbon dioxide from the left side of the reaction, where does it shift the equilibrium? To the left. Does that make sense? Now this whole shift to the left means that bicarbonate is more readily dissociates. We're good? Meaning that more protons and, not bicarbonate, sorry, carbonic acid more readily dissociates. Bicarbonate and hydrogen ion are more readily reacting to form carbonic acid. Does that make sense? Meaning that this reaction requires more hydrogen, which dissociates from hemoglobin that buffered it, making hemoglobin available for the oxygen binding. I don't know, think of it as a really far-fetched analogy is like a supply chain. Okay, hold on. Think about supply chain. So, say you are a business owner. You make something, some stuff, okay? And your stuff sells. Since it sells, you need to make more. Does that make sense? That stuff that you're selling is CO2. In order to make CO2, you need suppliers that will bring you some materials. That material that you make CO2 from is carbonic acid. Now, those suppliers that give you carbonic acid, they have their own suppliers. In order to make carbonic acids, those secondary suppliers provide bicarbonate and hydrogen. And in order to, provide those, hydrogen is provided by other suppliers, which is hemoglobin with hydrogen bound. Does that make sense? As long as your CO2 sells, all those suppliers will have a market as well. The minute you stop selling CO2, this whole supply chain stops. Does that make sense? Better sense, maybe? Okay? So basically, the processes in the tissues and processes in the lungs are the opposite. Okay? So in the tissues, essentially, elevated CO2 and elevated hydrogen ion concentration pushes the oxygen of hemoglobin, what we call a Bohr effect. Okay? Does that make sense? And that actually corresponds to so-called Haldane effect, which refers to, bless you, elevated levels of hemoglobin due to elevated CO2. So Bohr effect refers to the role of acid. Haldane effect refers to the role of CO2. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, what you should be able to answer to? What kind of questions? In the tissues, what does CO2 bind to? Hemoglobin. Does it bind? Yes. Which part? Protein part. Okay. What happens in the tissues? CO2 interacts with water, forming carbonic acid. What happens in the lungs? Hydrogen ions interact with bicarbonate, forming carbonic acid. Or carbonic acid dissociates into CO2 and water. Does that make sense? Know the basic reactions, okay? And please know the roles of proteins. So what albumin and hemoglobin, what are the roles in the tissues? What do they buffer? Hydrogen ions. Am I clear? So it looks complicated because it's chemistry. By the way, who likes chemistry? It's not bad. It's not bad. I was expecting like twice as less. Well, I do. All right, so I don't want to ask, do you have any questions on the CO2 transport? Because you either have a million or you have none. And so when we're going to do the study guide review, probably on Thursday, get ready with the questions. Okay? Now we're going to talk about the regulation of respiratory depth and respiratory rhythm. And it's a quick overview of the main parts of the nervous system that regulate respiration. And I'm going to break it down for you. So the main part is medulla. Okay? That makes sense. So in medulla you have two respiratory groups, ventral and dorsal. So let's take a look at what they do. So ventral generates breathing rhythm. So right now, as you are breathing, the main activity is coming off from ventral respiratory group. Am I clear? Does that make sense? Now, what's the role of dorsal respiratory group then? Look, input from stretch receptors first. Now, what do stretch receptors tell you? Look at me. Huh? Yes. And if it's really expanded, what should I do? Exhale. Stretch receptors ensure the smooth transition between inhalation and exhalation. Make sense? Chemoreceptors in the periphery. Chemoreceptors. What do they sense? Say again? Chemicals. Which chemicals are most important chemicals in terms of the respiratory system? CO2 and oxygen. We'll see oxygen somewhat. CO2 always goes together with hydrogen acid. So those chemoreceptors, they sense CO2 and pH and oxygen. Oxygen is not as important. So if you experience abnormally high level of CO2 in the blood, what's going to happen to your respiratory rate? Abnormal, yeah, you're going to exhale it. It's going to go up. Does that make sense? If you are hypoxic, so you have a lot of CO2, acidosis, you're going to start breathing faster. Does that make sense? That's the activity of dorsal respiratory group. Make sense? So if you look at this, your medulla regulates the main respiratory function, setting up, so here's the deal. It sets up the normal rhythm. And then it modifies it according to your activity. Running, being, after acidosis. If you dive and you hold your breath for a while, CO2 definitely accumulates in your blood. So when you get out of the water, your breathing rate and depth increase. Does that make sense? That's dorsal respiratory group. Pontine respiratory groups are responsible for adjusting the breathing patterns to various respiratory activities. Next time you speak, and I have to speak very louder than normal, okay? Next time you speak, try to pay attention to how you breathe. Your breathing pattern changes. Makes sense, right? That's pontine respiratory group. So if you wrap it out, medulla sets the normal rhythm and adjusts it to the body needs. Pontine respiratory group adjusts it to the activities like singing or talking. Makes sense, right? Aortic body, carotid body, they aren't on the picture. Those are the chemoreceptors. Aortic body is in the aortic arch. Carotid body is in the carotid arteries. Hypothalamus. Respiratory responses to emotions. When you're super excited, what happens to your respiratory rate? It goes up. That's hypothalamic. When you, cut yourself really bad, what happens with your respiration? What do? You take a breath. That's hypothalamic response. Does that make sense? So there's respiratory responses to emotions. Cortex. You can hold your breath. Can you suffocate yourself? Not mentally. You can, but it has to be a physical impact, right? So there's actually a protective mechanism that we're going to be talking about. Irritant reflexes, you coughing them out or sneezing them out, the irritants. Inflation or brew reflex. Here's the thing, it's pretty cool. When you inhale, your lungs stretch, and at some point this reflex will send the signals to inhibit the diaphragm and intercostal contraction, and you will exhale. So you cannot expand your lungs indefinitely. Does that make sense? Now, proprioceptors, I want to mention them last. You may say, hold on a second. How are proprioceptors involved in the regulation of respiratory rate? So, proprioceptors, they detect movements of joints and contraction of muscles. Now, vigorous movements of joints and muscle contractions are associated with what type of human endeavor? I know it sounds really complicated. When do you contract muscles and move your joints? When you exercise. And it's very interesting modifications that occur during exercise. Before we get there, let's take a look at the regulation of breathing rate by carbon dioxide. So, how deep you inhale is determined by how strongly your muscles are stimulated. How fast you breathe is determined by the length of activity of the respiratory center. Oh, speaking of the rhythm, interestingly enough, we don't know the mechanism that sets the normal respiratory rate. Like for heart, we do know pacemaker cells, right? But for lungs, we don't know. There's an idea that there's a set of neurons that reciprocally inhibit each other, setting up the rhythm, but we don't have a substantial evidence. So, let's talk about chemical factors that influence your respiratory rate and depth. Three main factors are CO2 concentration, oxygen concentration, and hydrogen. Oxygen being the least important. I'm sorry for the typo, but I know that it looks hilarious. I just noticed. Do you see that? It's not impotent. It's important. Okay? It's the most important. When concentration of CO2 in the blood goes up, okay, carbon dioxide in the brain goes up. Okay, pH in the brain goes down. Importantly, that stimulates the brainstem receptors, which elevate the depth and the rate of breathing. Now, when you can observe it, for instance, in a patient with the metabolic acidosis, let's say a patient who is severe alcoholic or coming out of really long stretch, or a patient who has failing kidneys, unable to filter out hydrogen ions, okay? So patients with metabolic acidosis will demonstrate elevated rate of breathing. It's not hyperventilation. They will just breathe faster and usually deeper, trying to exhale that extra CO2 and increase the pH of the blood. Does that make sense? Now, as we mentioned, hyperventilation is when you don't need to breathe that deep and fast. But you do, you reduce blood CO2 levels. And then, as we mentioned, vasoconstriction in the brain, fainting. Okay. Apnea is breathing cessation for a minute, usually from abnormally low CO2. Mechanisms for obesity-related sleep apnea are not completely elucidated, but it is known. People with obesity suffer from that condition when they have breathing cessation, usually in the night. They wake up. They don't suffocate, but they wake up. But that leads to severely impaired sleep quality. Okay. Now, other factors. Oxygen concentration. Not really important. Can you tell me why? Without looking at, why oxygen concentration in the blood, in the plasma, is not a primary signal, primary regulator of breathing rate and depth. Think about hemoglobin unloading. In the normal conditions, what percentage of oxygen is unloaded from hemoglobin in the tissues? 25%. You have plenty of oxygen still bound to hemoglobin. You have a huge depot. Does that make sense? So even if your tissue oxygen goes down, you have plenty of oxygen to supply. Make sense? pH is important, as we mentioned. So the example that I gave you before with the acidosis. So think about a patient with metabolic acidosis with failing kidneys. The CO2 in the blood is normal. The oxygen in the blood is normal. But pH is really low. So they will try to compensate for it by trying to exhale extra CO2. Does that make sense? Now, I somewhere have a wonderful manuscript, like 10 pages review on the physiological mechanisms of drowning. It's a great, really interesting read. But one fairly obvious from what we discussed. Imagine that somebody dives in the water, holding their breath, and keeps swimming. So oxygen underwater. No breathing, right? Only oxygen that's in the lungs and bound to hemoglobin, whatever. So slowly oxygen gets used up. And what's more important, CO2 starts to accumulate. Make sense? The person keeps holding breath. Now, is that possible that this person will just keep holding breath indefinitely and will suffocate? At some point, at certain CO2 concentration, the reflex for inhaling overrides conscious breath holding. Does that make sense? So people will try to hold their breath underwater, but at some point, stimulation by chemoreceptors will initiate inhalation. There's no oxygen, they will inhale water in their lungs. Does that make sense? But usually you feel it. And you try to get out of the water first. You feel that you can't really swim anymore. Those are hypothalamic controls. We talked about it. Now, that's cortical. So when CO2 is critically high, brainstem will reinstate normal breathing, even if you want to hold it. Irritant reflexes, we discussed it too. And this is a brewery reflex. Allows you to make a smooth transition from inhalation to exhalation. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to talk one last thing about adjustments. And the first is adjustment to the exercise. Exercise increases ventilation rate. Do you agree? May or may not increase depth, definitely increases rate. Now, based on your previous knowledge, the stuff that we went over, that you went over in the muscle physiology, is the stuff that we went over in metabolism and cardiovascular. When we exercise, what happens to the rate of cellular respiration in the tissues? Goes up, yeah. What happens to carbon dioxide production in the tissues? Production. When you exercise, carbon dioxide production in the tissues. Goes up, of course. Respiration is up, CO2 is up. I'm going to ask you a tricky question. What happens to in the healthy person during medium intensity exercise? I don't know, jogging or moderately lifting, okay? What happens to the concentrations of oxygen, CO2, and blood pH compared to resting state? What do you think? Kind of pushing you towards the wrong answer. Go ahead. Yes, they are. They are staying the same. And it's kind of counterintuitive, because you would expect, if somebody exercises, right, you would expect CO2 in the blood to go up. You would expect oxygen to go down. And you would expect pH to go down, right? But what essentially happens, when you start exercising, proprioceptors in your muscles and joints immediately activate respiratory centers. Does it make sense? So if I will go down in the hallway and I will start sprinting, my respiratory rate and depth will increase in a second. Does that make sense? It can be chemical mechanism. It takes chemical factors, they induce response that is much slower. Does that make sense? So respiratory adaptations to exercise are neural in nature. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's the activation of respiratory centers together with the motor cortex. It's the stimulation of respiratory centers by the signals from proprioceptors. It's conscious understanding. Yeah, I'm going to run. I know I'm running. Okay, does that make sense to you? This is why when you stop, your respiratory rate goes down pretty quickly. It doesn't go down completely to the resting state. That's a different story. You have, say, lactose, you have post-exercise oxygen consumption, all that kind of stuff. But it goes down quite substantially right away, because all those neural stimuli are gone. Does that make sense? Now, really important statement. You know how we say you can be in aerobic zone when you exercise, but when you exercise really hard, you get into anaerobic. Right? Anaerobic respiration in tissues starts not because of the respiratory system. Respiratory system in a healthy person, no matter how vigorous exercise is, will always provide sufficient amount of oxygen to the blood and will always remove all necessary carbon dioxide. Anaerobic respiration in the tissues, anaerobic metabolism, starts usually because of insufficient cardiac output. Either heart doesn't work as well, or muscles squeeze the blood vessels, and there's not enough blood reaching skeletal muscles. Does that make sense? Your respiratory system will be just fine. Okay? We're good? Now, adaptation to high altitude. Anyone experienced mountain sickness? How was it? Bad? What was elevation? I'm just curious.
We were driving through West Virginia on the way to Florida, and one of the main highways was shut down because I guess like a bridge came.
Uh-huh.
So we had to go all the way around. It took us up this huge mountain. We had to go like through it and through these tunnels. It was just
So so I don't know how high West Virginia mountains are, but don't want to sound arrogant and condescending, but I guess they aren't very high. But still, you can develop mountain sickness. you go to Colorado, oh, that's fun. Especially if you try to run in the morning. As a devoted runner, I couldn't pass on this opportunity, and I thought I'm going to make 3 miles this morning. After 2, I wanted to die, and I was barely moving. I was almost walking, okay? And that's what happens when you get to the high altitudes. I believe I was at about 8,000 feet, okay? So that's where we were staying during the conference. Oxygen levels drop, and drop significantly. So you have basically hypoxia, okay? Shortness of breath, oh yeah. I didn't have nausea or dizziness, but shortness of breath, be my guest. It was pretty awful, okay? Now, what kind of adaptations? Elevated blood flow to the brain, first of all, because, you know, brain cannot survive without oxygen, so you have higher blood flow. Now, the problem is, if you do it abruptly, like you go from Ohio to Kathmandu, Nepal, you're going to die. Well, no, not in Kathmandu. Let's say the last base camp on the way to Everest. Okay, yeah, you're going to die. Because the blood flow to the brain will increase so dramatically that you will develop pulmonary edema, cerebral edema, and die. Okay, you will develop pulmonary edema too, because blood flow in the pulmonary circulation will increase as well to pick up more oxygen. Does that make sense? So, if you decide to go like Colorado spot, you know, you go to, I don't know, Aspen, stay for a day, get acclimated, then move higher probably. So, main adaptations. Change in the sensitivity of chemoreceptors, okay? They will basically become more responsive to the higher concentration of CO2. So it will turn on the increased respiratory rate quicker. Does that make sense? So your breathing rate will be, you know, accelerated much faster than usual. That will lead to the increase in minute ventilation. So yeah, you will normally be breathing faster and deeper. Make sense? And over time, the long-term adaptation, elevated number of red blood cells. Now, from my personal experience, I don't know about long-term, but when I came back to Louisiana after 5 days, I was like Usain Bolt. I was flying. My red blood cells, for me, were probably skyrocketing. I should have done it before some race and just win. Because it was awesome feeling. You run at sea level, and it's like you walking. Because of all the adaptations that you underwent, you know, at the elevation, yes, higher altitude.
If that's at sea level, what if you went from like Aspen to Florida, which is below sea level? Would you go even faster, or would it really not matter?
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's that. I don't think it's that much below sea level. So if you compare it to Louisiana, they both pretty flat and pretty at the sea level. Louisiana holds it has the second lowest highest point of the state. So the highest point of the state of Louisiana is 150 feet. The lowest highest point in the state is in Delaware, I think. But they're pretty flat, you know. So if you leave at the higher altitude and you go to the lower, oh, you're going to be flying. Sorry. You're going to be flying. This is why a lot of professional endurance athletes, they will reside in the states like Utah, Colorado, you know, train there. And then when the race is on, you know, at the lower altitude, they will win it.
See, then why is that allowed? Like, that's
Why erythropoietin is not allowed?
Yeah, saying you're just living in a different part of the country. So why is
I kind of agree, but you don't expose yourself to any significant health risks by simply training in Utah. Okay? When you shoot EPO, you stimulate red blood cell production and increase your chances, for instance, to develop a stroke. Okay, so that's part of the deal. Now, another thing with acclimatization to altitude, when people climb Everest or any other high, mountain, they go through several base camps. And when I was a kid, I could never understand what's the point. How can you spend like half a year climbing the mountain? I can walk like 8 kilometers in 2 hours. So it's not only that it's steep and icy and snowy and all that kind of stuff. You have to adjust. And adjustment can take you only so far. Okay? In fact, the first person that climbed Everest alone, Reinhold Messner, I read his account of that event. So from the last base camp, which was something like 6 and a change thousand meters, he went by himself, so he could carry only so much. I don't remember I think he had an oxygen tank with him just in case. So he remembered himself getting on top. So like he was on Everest. He remembers it. And then he starts to descend, and then he doesn't remember anything. The next thing that he knows, he's in the base camp. So it turns out, the conditions, the oxygen deficit was so severe that he eventually passed out, despite all the acclimatization and stuff. I saw his photograph, like 6 foot tall, I think German or Swiss guy. So when he was found, his wife found him. His wife was Asian woman, pretty small, built. She found him, picked him up, and took him to the base camp. He was like 100 pounds. So he was like a skeleton. That's how much weight he lost on the way there, back, and then while he was lying in the snow. So those conditions, people who climb those extreme mountains, people, pilots, jet pilots, they wear oxygen masks when they fly there. These folks walk up the hill carrying a backpack. It's pretty badass, and it's also not healthy. Okay. So basically, 2 adjustments for altitude, main adjustments: immediate, increased minute ventilation, long-term red blood cell production. We're going to take a break.